Charlotte 911, do you need police, fire, or medic?
I need police. Somebody just been my house.
The operator's voice remains calm, but there's tension behind it.
I came home and I had a woman in my house, and I pulled out my gun and and she's not moving.
How old is she?
I have no idea. I don't even know the woman. She's inside my house in the hallway on the floor.
Is she flat on her back?
No, she's on her stomach. I can try to move her on her back. My husband told me don't touch her. Oh God, what did I do? What did I do?
At that moment, a young woman's life had just been stolen. It would take months of investigation, shocking evidence, and courtroom drama to reveal the truth about what really happened that morning. But the one thing that was immediately clear? Someone had just paid the ultimate price for another person's betrayal. This is the case of Tyra Crosby. A brutal murder disguised as a moment of passion. A cold-blooded killing wrapped in the disguise of self-defense. A betrayal so deep it left a family shattered and a community in shock. And at the center of it all? 3 lives, tangled in lies, jealousy, and death. But before we unravel the shocking twists of this case, make sure to subscribe to True Crime Watch HD and hit the notification bell. We bring you deep investigations into real crime stories that demand justice. Now, let's go back. Let's step inside that house on Porter Street and piece together the events that led to a night of deception, rage, and murder. Tyra Chanel Crosby had just celebrated her 25th birthday. She was young, ambitious, and full of life. Her mother, Tanya Hoskins, describes her as someone who could light up a room with her energy. Tyra loved fashion, so much that she had started her own clothing brand. She wasn't just a dreamer, she was a doer. But on the night of July 17, 2023, she made a decision that would unknowingly place her in the path of a jealous wife with a gun. She had gone out for the night, like any young woman her age would. Maybe it was just another way to unwind, enjoy a drink, and escape the pressures of life. But in the dim lights of a Charlotte club, she met someone. Albert Alexander. A 50-year-old man. Charming. Friendly. Confident. The kind of man who knew exactly what to say. What Tyra didn't know. Albert was married. And in less than 8 hours she would be lying dead inside his home. Albert Alexander was not an innocent bystander in this story. He was a married man, a man who knew his wife's schedule. A man who knew exactly when she would leave for work. That night, as he danced and flirted with Tyra in the club, he knew his wife, Stephanie Alexander, was out working. She worked different shifts trying to support her family while her husband. He was out at a bar picking up a woman half his age. At some point during the night he leaned in. Whispered something into Tyra's ear. Maybe he made her laugh. Maybe he told her she was beautiful. Then he said the words that would seal her fate. "Let's go back to my place." Tyra had no idea what she was walking into. To her this was just a fun night. A new guy. A new experience. Maybe it would lead to something more. She followed Albert home. The house on Porter Street was dark and quiet. It didn't feel dangerous. But danger doesn't always announce itself. Behind that door, in that very home, was a woman who had no idea that her world was about to be shattered. Tyra walked inside, completely unaware that she was being led into a deadly trap. She had no idea that in just a few hours she would be desperately calling for help, and no one would come. Stephanie Alexander was a hard-working woman. A mother. A wife. Someone who had spent years building a home with Albert. She had loved him. Trusted him. But on the morning of July 18, 2023, that trust shattered into a million pieces. She had left work early. She needed a laptop for a class assignment. She wasn't supposed to be home yet. She walked through the door, and immediately something felt off. A woman's clothes. Not hers. A pair of shoes she didn't recognize. A scent in the air that wasn't familiar. Her stomach dropped. Her heart started pounding. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She went straight for the gun. Stephanie wasn't thinking. She was reacting. She grabbed her firearm and made her way down the hall. She yelled for Albert. No response. She pushed open the bedroom door. And there they were. Albert, Tyra. Together. What happened next would become the subject of court debates, witness testimonies, and forensic analysis. According to Stephanie, she panicked. She never meant to shoot. She said she thought she was aiming at a wall, that she just wanted to scare the woman out of her home. But the forensic evidence told a different story. A story of rage, of control, of murder. Tyra's last moments weren't just captured in crime scene photos. They were recorded, on her own phone. Because in those terrifying seconds as she realized what was happening, She called her mother. She tried to speak, tried to cry out for help. But the call went straight to voicemail. The 8-minute recording left behind would later become the most damning piece of evidence in the case. The sound of struggling, of shouting, of a fight, then a gunshot, and then silence. This was no accident. The investigation would soon reveal shocking truths about what really happened inside that house. But was this a crime of passion, or a calculated execution? And what did Albert Alexander have to say about the woman who had just been killed, in his own home? The gunshot ripped through the quiet of the house on Porter Street. And then, nothing. For a few seconds the world stood still inside that home. The woman who fired the shot, Stephanie Alexander, stood there, her hands shaking, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. Before her, Tyra Crosby lay motionless. She was not an intruder. She was not a threat. But she was bleeding out on the floor. And then the silence shattered. Stephanie's husband, Albert Alexander, lunged forward, his voice thick with panic. "What did you do?" But Stephanie wasn't answering. She was staring at the body on the floor. The weight of what had just happened was hitting her like a tidal wave. She scrambled for her phone. Dialed 911. "I need police," she said. Her voice was frantic, breathless. "Somebody's been in my house. I saw a woman. I pulled out my gun, and she's not moving." The operator tried to keep her calm, tried to ask the right questions. "How old is she?" And that's when Stephanie froze. "I have no idea," she muttered. "I don't even know the woman." But that wasn't true. Because she knew exactly who Tyra Crosby was. And the investigators? They were about to prove it. By the time Charlotte Mecklenburg police arrived, the scene was already set in stone. Tyra Crosby's body lay in the hallway lifeless. A single gunshot wound had ended her life. Stephanie Alexander stood near the doorway, her gun nearby, her face pale. She had called 911. She had stayed. Albert? He stood back, silent, watching. But what exactly had he witnessed? Because when investigators walked in that morning, they weren't just stepping into a crime scene. They were stepping into a web of deception, rage, and betrayal. Stephanie told officers the same thing she told 911. "She was in my house. I got scared. I pulled out my gun. I didn't mean to shoot her." But here's where things got complicated. Albert wasn't backing her story. In fact, he was about to tell a very different version of events. A version where Tyra Crosby wasn't just some woman who broke into their house. A version where Albert had invited her there. Albert Alexander sat across from detectives, his hands shaking. At first he seemed cooperative. He admitted to meeting Tyra at the club. He admitted to bringing her home. But he stopped short of admitting any real responsibility. "I didn't know this would happen," he said. But detectives pressed harder. Because something wasn't adding up. Albert claimed that when Stephanie came home, she had immediately grabbed the gun. "She started yelling," he said. "She asked who was in the house. I told her to calm down. I tried to take the gun from her. And that's when Stephanie pulled the trigger." But was that true? Because Stephanie was telling a different version. A version where she claimed she thought she was shooting at the wall. But detectives weren't convinced. Because forensics was about to tell the truth. Crime scene investigators began their work immediately. They analyzed the body. They analyzed the bullet trajectory. They analyzed the position of the gun. And what they found? It shattered Stephanie's claims. Because Tyra Crosby had not been standing. She had been on the floor. And worse? She had been beaten before she was shot. Her injuries told a story, a violent, horrifying one. Bruises, scratches, signs of struggle. And then, the most damning piece of evidence. Tyra Crosby's final moments were recorded. At first, investigators weren't sure if they would ever know what truly happened inside that house. And then Tyra's mother stepped forward. She had received a voicemail. Not a normal voicemail. An 8-minute recording. A voicemail left by accident. A voicemail where her daughter was fighting for her life. Tanya Hoskins, Tyra's mother, sat across from detectives, her hands gripping the table. "She called me," she whispered. "I didn't answer in time." She played the recording. And for the first time the world heard the truth. The tape was haunting. Tyra's voice, pleading. Stephanie's voice, screaming. A struggle. A loud impact. Another. And another. A gunshot. And then? Silence. The detectives sat frozen. Because this was no accident. This wasn't a simple case of self-defense. This was something else entirely. A calculated act of violence. And now the charge was about to change. Stephanie Alexander had initially been charged with voluntary manslaughter, a charge that implied a crime of passion, a moment of uncontrolled rage. But now detectives had proof. And on August 3, 2023, the charges were upgraded. Second-degree murder. A charge that carried far more weight. A charge that could mean decades behind bars. Stephanie's fate was now in the hands of the justice system. The doors of the Mecklenburg County Courthouse swung open, and inside, a storm was brewing. The trial of Stephanie Alexander was about to begin. For months, the case had been the talk of Charlotte. News stations followed every development, court reporters dissected every legal move, and the public? They were divided. Some called it a crime of passion. Others called it cold-blooded murder. But today, the decision wouldn't be made by the public. It would be made by 12 jurors. And seated in the courtroom, facing the woman accused of taking her daughter's life, was Tanya Hoskins. She had waited for this moment. She had fought for this moment. Because this wasn't just about the law. This was about justice for Tyra. The prosecutor, a seasoned attorney with a reputation for relentless cross-examinations, stood before the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, today you will hear the truth about what happened on July 18, 2023. He turned to face Stephanie Alexander, who sat with her defense team, her expression unreadable. This case is not about self-defense. It is not about fear. This is about a choice to kill. And the evidence will show that the defendant knew exactly what she was doing. The jury was silent, hanging on to every word. We have forensic proof. We have witness testimony. And we have something even more powerful, a recording. A recording that captured Tyra Crosby's final moments. The courtroom shifted at those words. Everyone knew about the voicemail. But today, they were going to hear what was on it. Then it was the defense attorney's turn. He adjusted his tie, looked at the jury, and took a breath. Ladies and gentlemen, let's not rush to judgment. He paced the courtroom, his voice steady. My client, Stephanie Alexander, is not a killer. She is a wife, a mother, a woman who walked into her own home and was confronted with the unthinkable. He paused. Imagine this. You come home from work. You walk into your bedroom. And there in your own bed, is a stranger. A stranger with your husband. He let the silence sit. This was not premeditated murder. This was not a cold-blooded act. This was an emotional, heat-of-the-moment reaction. The battle lines were drawn. The prosecution saw a deliberate execution. The defense saw a moment of blind rage. Now, it was up to the evidence. The first witness was the 911 dispatcher who took Stephanie's call. The prosecutor played the call for the jury. I need police. Somebody's been shot in my house. I saw a woman, I pulled out my gun, she's not moving. The jury listened carefully. Then the prosecutor asked, did the defendant sound panicked? The dispatcher nodded. Yes, she did. Did she say the woman was attacking her? No. Did she mention being in danger? No. A small but crucial detail. Because if Stephanie had truly feared for her life, wouldn't she have said so? The defense objected. Said panic does strange things to the human mind. But the damage was done. The jury was already thinking. Next, the prosecution called the lead forensic investigator. He had analyzed everything from blood splatter to gunpowder residue. What can you tell us about the position of the victim at the time of the shooting? The forensic expert flipped open a file. The victim, Tyra Crosby, was not standing when she was shot. She was on the floor. The bullet trajectory suggests she was already in a vulnerable position. The jury leaned in. So, to be clear, she was not charging at the defendant? That is correct. The prosecution had just shattered Stephanie's self-defense claim. But the most damning revelation was yet to come. For months, the voicemail had been discussed. But now, it would be played in court. Tanya Hoskins sat in the front row, her hands clenched together. The judge gave a solemn nod. And the recording began. At first static. Then, Tyra's voice. Please, please stop. A loud impact. A scream. A struggle. Then another voice. Stephanie's voice. Angry. Furious. Unrelenting. Get out of my house. You think you can just walk in here? A thud. Another scream. Then, a gunshot. And after that, silence. The recording ended. The courtroom was frozen. Tanya buried her face in her hands. The prosecution let the silence sit. Then the attorney turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, does this sound like an accident? Nobody moved. Because at that moment, everyone in that room knew the answer. The defense attorney jumped into action. Objection, Your Honor. This is an emotional appeal. The judge waved him off. Overruled. The defense had to change the strategy. So they tried something new. Mrs. Alexander, the defense attorney said, "Why did you pick up the gun?" Stephanie looked down. "I was scared." "Scared of what?" "I don't know. I wasn't thinking." "Did you mean to kill her?" "No. I just wanted her gone." And there it was. She just wanted her gone. The prosecutor seized the moment. "So you knew exactly who she was?" Stephanie hesitated. And in that one moment, the courtroom felt the tide shift. The prosecution had laid out their case piece by piece. The forensic evidence. The chilling voicemail. The inconsistencies in Stephanie Alexander's version of events. Now there was one person left to testify. The man at the center of it all. Albert Alexander. The husband. The instigator. The reason Tyra Crosby was in that house in the first place. And the courtroom was ready to hear what he had to say. Albert walked to the stand slowly, his hands clenched in his lap as he swore to tell the truth. The prosecutor wasted no time. "Mr. Alexander, let's go back to the night of July 17, 2023. You met Tyra Crosby that night, correct?" Albert nodded. His voice was low. "Yes, I did." "And you invited her back to your home?" "Yes." The prosecutor paced in front of him. "Did you tell her you were married?" A long pause. Albert swallowed. "No." "So, to be clear, you invited a 25-year-old woman back to a home you shared with your wife, knowing your wife could return at any time?" "Yes." The courtroom was dead silent. Tanya Hoskins, Tyra's mother, sat in the front row, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Did you ever think about how dangerous that decision was?" Albert shifted in his seat. "I didn't think it would go like this." "Go like this." The prosecutor's voice was sharp now. "Mr. Alexander, your decision set everything in motion. You invited Tyra into a situation she had no knowledge of. And now she's dead. Do you take responsibility for that?" Albert's lips pressed together. "I didn't pull the trigger." It was the answer that sent a ripple through the courtroom. Because no, he hadn't pulled the trigger. But wasn't he just as responsible? The defense attorney knew Albert was a liability. So they tried to control the damage. "Mr. Alexander," the defense lawyer said, "did you expect your wife to come home early that morning?" "No." "Did you ever tell Miss Crosby to leave?" Albert hesitated. I was going to. But before you could, Stephanie came home?" "Yes." "And what happened next?" "She started yelling. Asking who was in the house." "Did she grab the gun immediately?" Albert shook his head. "Not immediately. But she did grab it?" "Yes." "Did she threaten Tyra?" Albert's lips parted, but he hesitated. Because this was it. The moment where his words could decide everything. His eyes darted to Stephanie. "Yes, she did." The defense was crumbling. Because if Stephanie had threatened Tyra before pulling the trigger, this wasn't self-defense. This wasn't an accident. This was a choice. The prosecutor stood. "Mr. Alexander, when your wife pulled that trigger, what did she say?" Albert closed his eyes. And then he whispered. "She said, 'That'll teach you.'" The courtroom gasped. Tanya burst into quiet sobs. And just like that, the truth was out. Stephanie had not fired in fear. She had fired out of anger. And now there was no going back. After weeks of testimony, after forensic evidence and gut-wrenching recordings, it was time for the closing arguments. The prosecution stepped forward first. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've seen the evidence. You've heard the testimony. But more importantly, you've heard the last words spoken before a young woman was murdered. This was not a mistake. It was not self-defense. It was a calculated, deliberate act of rage. And no matter how much the defense tries to frame it otherwise, we all know the truth." He pointed to Stephanie Alexander. "She pulled the trigger. And she did it with intent." Then the defense took the floor. "My client is not a murderer. She is a woman who made a mistake. A tragic, irreversible mistake. But a mistake nonetheless. She acted out of fear, out of betrayal. She did not wake up that morning planning to kill. And that is what separates a crime of passion from cold-blooded murder." The jury sat stone-faced, listening, analyzing. Because in just a few short hours, they would be the ones to decide Stephanie Alexander's fate. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. Stephanie sat stiff, her face unreadable. Tanya sat in the front row, her body rigid with anticipation. Would justice be served? Would her daughter's life mean something in the eyes of the law? Finally the jury returned. And when they did, the room held its breath. The verdict was in. But what would it be? Would Stephanie Alexander be convicted of second-degree murder? Would the jury see intent behind the trigger pull? Or would they believe the defense's argument of a tragic mistake? And most importantly, would Tyra Crosby finally get the justice she deserved? The courtroom was silent. 12 jurors sat in their seats, their faces unreadable. The judge asked the foreperson to stand. The moment had arrived. Stephanie Alexander kept her gaze low, her hands trembling. Tyra Crosby's mother, Tanya Hoskins, gripped the edge of the wooden bench, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. This was it. After weeks of grueling testimony, forensic evidence, and gut-wrenching recordings, it all came down to this moment. The judge turned to the jury. Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a verdict? The woman stood, holding a folded piece of paper in her hands. Yes, Your Honor, we have. She handed the paper to the bailiff, who walked it to the judge. The entire courtroom seemed frozen in time. The judge unfolded the paper. Read it. Then she turned to Stephanie Alexander and spoke the words that would change her life forever. We, the jury, find the defendant. A breathless pause. Guilty of voluntary manslaughter. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Voluntary manslaughter. Not murder. Not self-defense. A crime of passion. Stephanie exhaled sharply, her body sagging in relief. But on the other side of the room, Tanya Hoskins stood up. Her face twisted in agony. No. No, this isn't justice, she shouted. Tears streamed down her face. She had fought for second-degree murder. She had believed her daughter was executed in cold blood. But the jury saw it differently. To them it wasn't premeditated. It was a crime of rage. Tanya covered her face with her hands. Her worst fears had come true. Stephanie Alexander was guilty, but she wasn't going away forever. The judge banged the gavel, calling for order. Ms. Alexander, please rise. Stephanie stood, her hands clenched at her sides. The judge stared at her, her expression stern but emotionless. The court acknowledges the tragic circumstances of this case. While the loss of life can never be undone, the law must reflect both the actions taken and the intent behind them. She looked down at the sentencing guidelines before delivering her ruling. Stephanie Alexander, you are hereby sentenced to 60 to 84 months in prison. Gasps filled the room again. 5 to 7 years. That was all. The sentence felt like a slap in the face to Tyra's family. Tanya shook her head in disbelief. She killed my baby, and she'll be free before I even have time to grieve. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the weight of her words filled the entire courtroom. Stephanie was led away in handcuffs. But even as she disappeared through the courtroom doors, Tanya knew. This wasn't justice. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed. Cameras flashed. Journalists threw out questions. Tanya, do you believe justice was served? She turned, her eyes filled with anger and sorrow. No. Justice would be my daughter alive. Justice would be that woman serving real time for what she did. Her voice shook. She was invited into that house. She didn't break in. She didn't threaten anyone. She was just there. And for that she was killed. Tanya took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. I will not stop fighting. This is not over. But deep down, she knew that the system had failed Tyra. Her daughter was gone. And no sentence would ever bring her back. As the days passed, another question began to rise. What about Albert Alexander? He had been the catalyst for everything. He had lied to Tyra. He had brought her home. He had stood there while she was attacked. And yet, he walked free. No charges. No consequences. While 2 women's lives had forever changed that night, one buried, one behind bars, he was allowed to continue living his life. Many believed he should have been charged. That if he had been honest, none of this would have happened. But the law didn't see it that way. And so, he slipped through the cracks. A few months later, Tanya stood in front of her daughter's grave. It was a cold, gray afternoon. She traced the letters of Tyra's name on the headstone. You deserved better, she whispered. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you. Tears welled in her eyes. I love you, baby. I always will. She placed a single white rose on the grave and stepped back. Tyra Crosby's story would never be forgotten. Her mother would make sure of that. And though the justice system had failed her, Tanya refused to let her daughter's name be lost in the darkness. She would keep fighting. For Tyra. For justice. For every woman who had ever been a victim of someone else's choices. Because this case was not just about a single gunshot. It was about how easily the truth can be twisted. how quickly victims can become villains, and how too often real justice never comes. Now we turn to you. Do you believe Stephanie Alexander's sentence was fair? Should Albert Alexander have been charged for his role in this tragedy? And most importantly, how do we stop cases like this from happening again? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters. And if you want to hear more stories like this, real cases that demand justice, make sure to subscribe to True Crime Watch HD and turn on notifications. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, stay aware, and remember, the truth always finds its way out. This is True Crime Watch HD.